I'm Brett Baer.
I'm Maria Bartiromo.
I'm Brian Kilmeade, and this is the Fox News Rundown. Friday, January 13th, 2023. I'm Chris Foster. First former President Trump and now a special counsel investigation into President Biden having classified documents.
You have this issue of documents that were found that were classified, not properly stored, not properly accounted for. So at the core, there are some similarities.
We speak with Fox News Sunday host Shannon Bream.
I'm Lisa Brady. Crime is down, but carjackings are way up in one major city, driven in part by juveniles who may not be thinking about the rest of their lives.
The one thing that they don't have that we had is, in my generation, is the ability to make a mistake and not have it haunt you for the rest of your life. With social media, you know, what you do is memorialized forever.
And I'm Jerry Baker of The Wall Street Journal. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Attorney General Merrick Garland has ordered an independent special counsel investigation into classified documents from President Biden's time as vice president in the Obama administration.
This appointment underscores for the public the department's commitment to both independence and accountability in particularly sensitive matters.
Special counsel Robert Hur is a former top federal prosecutor in Maryland. The president's legal team found documents in a Washington, D.C. office once used by the president, then at his home in Wilmington, Delaware.
People know I take classified documents and classified material seriously. I also said we're cooperating fully and completely with the Justice Department's review.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
I think Congress has to investigate this.
Attorney General Garland already has an independent special counsel investigating former President Trump and his having classified documents at his home in Florida.
There are similarities, but there are big differences.
Shannon Bream's the host of Fox News Sunday.
With the former president, the fight went on back and forth for a while before we got to that. DOJ doesn't like to call it a raid, but that search at Mar-a-Lago. And what the White House will say now about the documents that have been discovered so far, we're working with archives, we're working, cooperating with any investigation with DOJ, we're quickly turning things over. So there are some differences, but at the core, you have this issue of documents that were found that were classified, not properly stored, not properly accounted for. So at the core, there are some similarities. Listen, the fact that the first tranche of government documents that apparently were found within the Biden sphere, that was discovered before the midterms. And so that's going to lend fuel to this fire that this information was withheld. The DOJ is treating R's and D's differently. Whether they are or not, it fuels the perception that they are.
Yeah, not that this is necessarily a crime, but as the expression goes, sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime. And I'll be curious to find out when they knew, when we should have maybe known about this and why it was withheld, if it was just for political reasons because the midterms coming up. Now, I wonder also if this will add to the pile of investigations that House Republicans have already announced. What's the status of those now that Kevin McCarthy's moved into the Speaker's office?
Yeah, so now we have committee chairs, we have committee assignments, and oversight has already said we're going to look at the Biden documents. We're going to look at the failure to maintain correct custody. I mean, they already had a slew of things they were going to look at, but that's added to the list. So they also, in party line vote, approved the select subcommittee on potential weaponization of federal agencies against political opponents. So listen, that is going to be a big point of contention. It's probably going to be the flip of the January 6th committee, where there are questions about whether Democrats are going to go ahead and appoint members to that committee. Will they go ahead and cooperate with it? That was one of the criticisms of Republicans, is that because they couldn't have exactly who they wanted on the January 6th committee, they pulled everybody. And so they end up with two Republicans there, Cheney and Kinzinger, who were not going to defend President Trump. So you leave your position, sort of your flank, undefended. It'll be interesting to see if Democrats go along with that select subcommittee, but they're calling it things like an insurrection subcommittee and saying that Republicans are declaring war on law and order and on federal law enforcement agencies. So that's going to be a big point of contention over the next couple of years.
Well, when we spoke last week, there was no Speaker of the House, and now there is. Kevin McCarthy says the fight for the job only makes him stronger and makes the party stronger. What do we know about the concessions he made to get the job? I guess most of them are public by now, and how that might affect what actually gets done in Congress. There's going to be a debt ceiling fight coming up that needs to be resolved.
Exactly. And that's going to come sooner rather than later. And that is going to be a big part of this rules package, of this deal to get to the speakership, offsetting and capping things at fiscal year 22. there are conversations about how that impacts defense spending. Now, the vast majority of Republicans will say, well, that's not where the cuts are going to come from. We're not going to do defense spending because the White House and Democrats have called out, like, look what you've done. You've now, because they were also, concerned about defense spending in the past and making sure that there was more of it. It's funny how these political things flip people. Democrats have said in the past, some of them, there's too much defense spending. We need more accountability. We need to trim that back. Well, now that it looks like Republicans would have the tools to do that, they're raising questions about it. So Republicans insist the cuts aren't going to come from defense, but they got to come from somewhere if they stick to this framework that they've agreed to in the rules. So with that debt ceiling coming, it's going to get ugly real fast.
Yeah. And as they say, the third rail of politics is those entitlements. Yeah. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. If that's the bucket they're going to dip into, some Republicans say, let's do it. Some don't.
Yeah. And you remember the commercials that seem to depict a former Speaker of the House throwing grandma over a cliff in her wheelchair, because that's how ugly it gets when we start talking about entitlements. The thing that Republicans will argue is, listen, the program's going to be insolvent within a couple of decades. And so we have to make changes or it won't be there for anyone. Where Democrats will sound the alarm and say, hey, listen, people who are on fixed incomes and are, now depending on these entitlements, or they've worked their lives and paid into it and they expect it's going to be there for them. It's very easy to, make them unnerved by saying there may be some cuts and changes to maybe extending the age at which you can collect some of these benefits or retirement age. But the conversation is ongoing that without some kind of trimming, it may go away for everybody.
Yes. I mean, 62 or 65 years old, wherever you want to cash out, isn't what it used to be. And I don't know. I don't know how the formula has changed over the years, or if it has, now that people aren't, living in retirement for 7 years, they're living in it for 30 years.
Right. And listen, a lot of our laws out there haven't kept up with changes. And of course, longevity, life expectancy has gone up for the most part over the last few decades. And that's a good thing. But you do have to then consider how you live on in those decades that are past the retirement age now. It's just like when they start debating about big tech and Section 230 and all these other things, that our technology has advanced so far that a lot of the laws that are being applied to it are from landline phones. I mean, that's when those laws were passed. So there's some catching up to do, but to do anything significant and monumental on Capitol Hill takes a lot of bipartisan will. And there are very few places we're seeing that right now.
Yeah, even including with immigration. President Biden did make that trip to the border. He was in El Paso, Texas, didn't actually see any migrants. And of course, it's just being called a photo op. Now, do we know, for one thing, who cleared those migrants out for him not to see?
I don't know. I don't know if that was local officials. You remember there's a lot of conversation about El Paso. Some of the local officials there, one has gone public and says she was told by leadership in El Paso that the White House pressured them months ago not to declare an emergency when it was clear the city was really struggling with the amount of immigrants they had showing up. So it's been a political situation in El Paso, but yeah, those streets look very different by the time the president showed up. And we know the numbers haven't abated. The administration rolled out a few proposals last week. They were to handle asylum cases differently and better. And the left, listen, no mistake that the right is going to be no surprise after the president on immigration. But, some of the left came after him last week with those proposals they rolled out saying these are inhumane. You're using policies of the Trump administration, which you'll remember they said were inhumane and cruel. And this administration is now realizing that they may want to use some of those same tools to try to manage the chaos.
President's approval rating, meantime, I was surprised to see a bit, is at 44.1% on average. And that's the highest it's been since October 21. We'll see what's been going on more recently affects that. Now, we had a big air travel meltdown this week, and some Republicans are blaming the administration in general, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg specifically. Now, I don't know if you can blame them for FAA problems, but I am wondering why there aren't more redundancies in place to handle a computer system failure like this. It happens.
Well, and listen, after what happened over Christmas with Southwest and, big conversations about updating infrastructure and computer systems and staffing and all those kinds of things, because there are folks inside Southwest saying, we've been warning that we were going to hit this at some point, this inflection point. It's horrible that it happens over the holidays where everybody's traveling. But against that backdrop, to then now have this other failure for the FAA was not a good look for the air industry. I got to tell you, I had to price out a bunch of flights for a number of work obligations and different things I have going on. The prices are astronomical. They're insane. And so I think people are hitting a point where, wow, these are, really big decisions you have to make about where you're going to spend this money if you need to go somewhere. and the service being terrible. Now, part of that is, does it fall into the private airlines? And part of it is separately this government FAA situation. But immediately, of course, the fingers are going to point at Buttigieg, and they're going to, bring up more instances of him as a government official flying on private aircraft and those kinds of things. So, it's not something the Biden administration would want to give Republicans when over on the House, they're already talking, as we've said, about so many investigations. I am sure Secretary Buttigieg, I'm sure he may be getting called over there to answer some questions too.
Yeah, man. I mean, we were planning, just a short little family vacation, and we crossed anything that involving air travel off the list. It's just, it doesn't seem worth the hassle at the moment. Shannon,
or the price.
Right. Yeah. Now, Shannon, I know you keep a close eye on the Supreme Court. There's been a sort of a pushback on its own gun ruling last year. What came out of the New York case?
Yeah, so we had the situation where, there's an ongoing dispute over the law in New York, which was passed after there was direction given from the Supreme Court about how far you can and cannot go when it comes to limiting gun rights, the right to bear arms. And so what happens is you've got New York sticking to this new law that it's put together. And it's, I think, undoubtedly going to end up at the Supreme Court again. But in the meantime, the justices are allowing that law to stay in place, very restrictive, while the challenges on the merits play out. And there was, a comment by Justices, I think, Alito and Thomas, not a formal dissent, but kind of saying, listen, we've given guidance. This is probably going to come back to the court. If you are trying to follow our guidance, stay at it legally, and we'll decide this when we have to decide it.
Last thing, then I'll let you go and prepare for Fox News Sunday. Former President Trump has been pretty quiet, except for, social media as usual. He's been loud there, but he hasn't done a lot, or he hasn't done anything really publicly since he announced he's going to run for president again. There was an event later this month in South Carolina. Not a big rally, they say, just something laying the groundwork. Are you surprised at how quiet he's been?
Well, this was, criticism, even of people who support him and want him to run again, was like, they were saying, why do this before the holidays? Did he want to capitalize off the midterms? I think if they had been more of that red tsunami, it would have been a better time for an announcement. But things kind of get lost through the holidays. And so some people forget he's even made a formal announcement. He's the only person formally in on the Republican side. But yeah, it's been sort of quiet. And, we're hearing more about this groundwork he's going to lay in South Carolina, one of those key early states. But other people seem to be taking their time. They feel like he announced really early, so they have time to sort of think about it. The Pences, the Pompeos, the Nikki Haley's, Tim Scott, we could name, dozens of people, DeSantis, whoever. So it kind of feels like the announcement didn't happen, but it did. And he's officially in.
Shannon Bream, Fox News Sunday host. Thanks. See you later.
Bye.
This is Jerry Baker with your Fox News commentary coming up.
For some U.S. cities, 2022 ended on a positive note when it comes to crime, though the recent surge across the country didn't magically end for the start of the new year.
We're in a crisis. Crime is at an all-time high and rising even more. We've taken all the power out of the police's hands in the court systems now as well.
Former Chicago police officer Anthony Napolitano is now an alderman and says these were problems in the making before the pandemic. Officials have blamed much of Chicago's gun violence in particular on gang activity. But shootings aren't the only issue. In Detroit, violent crime overall was down 11% year over year in 2022, while the number of carjackings soared, up 21%. And much of that increase is pinned on juvenile crime.
Well, we've seen a number of different contributing factors.
Detroit Police Chief James White.
We've seen a lot of young people with, frankly, more time on their hands than in years previous due to COVID. Schools still have not returned completely to pre-COVID attendance for a number of reasons. Social media also is impacting the ability of these young folks to coordinate and communicate about a number of things. I don't know if you have heard of the Kia Boys. And these are a lot of young kids that are going around stealing Kia vehicles. And they're doing it a number of different ways because they're easy to steal. And then we've seen some teenagers that have, simply learned that if you scare someone and take their vehicle by way of carjacking, that there's a greater likelihood that they'll leave their purse or they'll leave something of value inside. And they'll just simply do it, to take some money and take some valuables and then dump the car and go about their business. It's a number of different things that's happening. Young folks have historically made, poor choices. We've all been kids and not necessarily made the best decisions when you're in that 13 to 17, 18 age range. And nothing's different in this generation. I just think they got more access to things and a greater opportunity to make bad decisions. And I don't know if they're really looking at the seriousness of the decisions that they're making.
Are they not looking at carjacking as a serious crime, perhaps, as well?
Well, there's some communication about things, whether it be through their own circles or, there's even carjacking in video games now that is treated as if it's nothing. So I think kids emulate what they see and hear in music. I'm not trying to suggest that, that the music is driving it, but I'm saying that all of these influencers play a part. And when these kids are bombarded with these negative influences, they react.
What about money as perhaps one of the main motivators? And is youth crime, in general, something that's any worse than it has been in past generations? Or are kids maybe not working as much as in past generations?
Well, we looked at that. We examined that. And we, in Detroit, we're in a really good place as it relates to employability of young people. And I will tell you, statistically, we see an impact on those kids that are engaged in professional work during the summer where they don't have those negative interactions. So I do think in some regards that money is a factor, but I think that employing kids and giving them different experiences and different opportunities does have an impact. However, that aside, we have still seen in 2021, we had 37 young people between the ages of 13 and 17 offenders of carjacking. We had 9 of them were victims of carjacking. In 2022, that number jumped to 10 victims of carjacking, and 51 of our carjacking offenders were between the ages of 13 and 17. Now, you can argue that perhaps, the group that was isolated with work opportunities and things like that were outside of these numbers. Obviously they were, but we didn't see the resulting impact of hiring young people and the correlation with the carjacking numbers involving juveniles dropping.
I read that part of your efforts to kind of, help fight this situation, not just with carjackings, but I guess with youth crime in general, is to give kids some real life examples of how bad choices can affect, the rest of your life. Planning to maybe send cops into classrooms before summer break. Is that something that's still in the works?
Oh, it absolutely is. So we have a couple different things. We have a program called the Brotherhood, and we have a program called the Sisterhood. And this is our ceasefire unit. This is a born program out of Detroit Police Department. One of our officers who has locked up a number of gang members that are young people. And he said, what can we do differently? Because locking kids up isn't the answer, right? I mean, you can't arrest your way out of this crisis. And so he came up with a program called the Brotherhood. It was so successful that we made the Sisterhood for the young ladies. And so the program is successful, but it's not enough. And more needs to be done. And, I'm not a proponent of scared straight programs. I don't think they work. I think, frankly, that most of our kids are already scared, which is why they're engaging in some of this behavior. But what I am a proponent of is being honest and transparent with young people and really talking through choices and being transparent from the standpoint of, oftentimes people my age like to tell young people that, we had it so hard and, we walk to school 5 miles uphill and they have it so much easier than we do. I oppose that. I don't think we have it easier. I think they have it much worse than we did, because the one thing that they don't have that we had is, in my generation, is the ability to make a mistake and not have it haunt you for the rest of your life. With social media, what you do is memorialized forever.
I know you've said, especially as it pertains to youth crime, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. But do you think that the current punishments are enough? Or are they not severe enough for something like carjacking?
So severe enough penalties. I mean, we could do a whole discussion on that alone. But when we talk about the severity of penalty for carjacking, I think, number one, there has to be communication to the community what a carjacking is and what will and can happen if you are charged with carjacking, convicted of carjacking. At a state level, it could go up to life in prison, depending on what the aggravating factors are. At the federal level, you're talking federal time, which is guaranteed time. And it's certainly something that is going to impact your life forever. It is a very serious crime that I don't think gets the necessary conversation around it. But when you talk about severity of penalty for youth, that's one that we have to talk about severity versus effectiveness. And I think, severity and effectiveness for young people needs to be studied. I think effective penalties for young people includes the criminal penalty of time, but there also has to be some restorative practices in it that educate and prepare them for returning to the community and living a productive life. I'd like to see a lot more work done in areas where we help young people who have made poor choices to return to society and be productive members of society, as opposed to creating an environment where it's one and done. I'm just very concerned when an undeveloped mind of a 13-year-old does an adult act and we're treating them as an adult and giving them the penalty as an adult when they didn't have the tools as an adult to make the decision that they made.
Overall, violent crime has been down in Detroit by some metrics that appears to be a nationwide trend. What's been working in Detroit to help lower violent crime? And are you doing anything differently than before the pandemic?
We are. We have a 5-point plan that focuses on quality of life, community engagement, being out there on the ground, walking our neighborhood streets, letting our community engage with us, demystifying policing, if you will. I myself patrol our streets on foot, getting to know our neighbors, getting confidence built in our community where they can share information with us. In large part, policing is a reactive business. It's something bad happens, people call police, we come out, and we solve the crime. You need community. You need community because community is going to tell you who's in the neighborhood that's victimizing the neighborhood. Community is going to tell you who's breaking in houses, who's stealing cars. Someone's going to talk to someone. And if you don't have that community connection, you're not going to be able to effectively police the community, and thereby you're not going to be able to reduce crime.
I know your department responded to more than 17,000 mental health related calls last year, an all-time high. Are you responding to those calls differently in the past? And is that part of perhaps what makes the job that you do, more difficult than ever?
Nothing good came out of COVID, but if one thing positive that came out of COVID is that it illuminated a mental health crisis in this country. And I think isolating people for that year brought this thing to the forefront. And now we cannot unsee it. It's a crisis in our country. It's a crisis in our city. And police departments across this country, as well as Detroit, are dealing with people who are in crisis. I mean, arguably, anytime you have someone that's engaged in high levels of violence, you probably are dealing with someone that's dealing with some emotional issues at some point. But now we're seeing in record numbers suicides, attempt suicides, impulse decision-making, people who are engaging in high-risk behavior and high violence. We have done a number of different things differently. We will, certainly our attitude on crime is that we will relentlessly pursue those who victimize those who live, work, and play in our city. But at the same time, we have to be sensitive to those who are in mental health crisis. And as such, we have a mental health co-response where we partner with our local mental health facility, and we do a co-response with non-sworn and sworn officers who are just simply trained in mental health, but not mental health professionals. But that co-responder is a mental health professional. And we do everything in our power to reduce the likelihood of injury to the officers and the citizen. But the reality of it is the reason that the police are called is because the person is exhibiting unpredictable behavior. When the police respond, they're dealing with someone who is unpredictable, sometimes violent, and sometimes a threat to themselves and others. And those situations continue to threaten the safety of our city and our officers. And it's one that we are dealing with on a daily basis. So there's some 17,000 last year, and already this year we're off to a start that shows that we're going to be, if not over that number, very close to it if the trend keeps up.
Well, Detroit Police Chief James White, we thank you and your officers for all that you do, and thank you for spending some time with us.
All right. Thank you very much. Happy New Year, and thank you for having me.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers. A new study finds that kindness may be good medicine when it comes to beating feelings of depression and anxiety. Researchers at The Ohio State University say that performing good deeds leads to mental health improvements as well as making people feel more connected with others. Scientists who worked on the study say when we help others, it takes our mind off the negative thoughts that would otherwise be consuming our attention when suffering from depression and anxiety. The research included 122 people in Ohio with moderate to severe symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. And they were divided into 3 groups. One group was told to plan social get-togethers 2 days a week, while another was told to perform 3 acts of kindness daily for 2 days a week. It could be something like baking cookies for someone or leaving a sticky note with encouraging words. The third group was told to keep track of negative thought patterns. After 10 weeks of doing these things, the researchers say all 3 groups reported an increase in life satisfaction and a drop in depression and anxiety symptoms. Study co-author David Craig summed it up saying, quote, something as simple as helping other people can go above and beyond other treatments in helping heal people with depression and anxiety. One more reason to bring a little kindness to the people around us. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
Put the power of over 100 meteorologists and the worldwide resources of Fox in your hands with the Fox Weather Podcast. Precise, personal, powerful. Subscribe and listen now at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jerry Baker.
What's on your mind?
We live in a political age that we might call the Great Inversion. Not very long ago, college-educated professionals voted Republican in vast numbers, while blue-collar workers picked Democrats. Now a college degree is the most reliable indicator of Democratic preference. The proletariat is dependably Republican. Liberals used to be passionate defenders of free speech. Now progressives seek to shut down dissent wherever they find it. But perhaps the most consequential inversion of all may be this, the switch the 2 main parties have made in their approach to governing. It was Will Rogers who's credited with the line, "I'm not a member of any organised political party. I'm a Democrat." For decades, this was no joke. For the left, ideological purism was always more important than the messy, tedious, compromise-tainted business of actually governing. Republicans, like conservatives the world over, have traditionally tended to favour pragmatism over purity. For them, Benjamin Disraeli's dictum was paramount. Damn your principles, stick to your party. There were intramural fights, of course, vicious at times, and there were significant ideological changes over time. But the categorical imperative of politics, governing, generally prevailed. But today, it's the Democratic Party that may be the most ruthlessly organised and efficient political entity in the world, and I include in that the Chinese Communist Party. The Democrats took a 50-50 nation in 2020 after a contentious election won by the narrowest of margins, primarily because just enough voters saw them as the lesser evil. And then Democrats seized the opportunity to advance one of the most ambitious agendas of any government in recent history. Trillions of additional dollars in federal spending, expanded regulation, the steady erosion of the national border, and a relentless, intensifying war on our traditional culture and values. And we can denounce, and we should, the activism and deplore the outcome, but we can only marvel at the political efficiency with which it's been achieved. Democrats have been demonstrating this impressive willingness to band together for a long time. In 2009 and 2010, many of them voted for Obamacare, well aware that it would cost them their political futures. Joe Biden will shortly announce his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. Despite his age, his evident cognitive decline, and even though by this time next year the US economy could be mired in recession, he will be re-nominated by acclamation. The Republicans, meanwhile, are about to embark on yet another orgy of self-mutilation, one that may make last week's Grand Guignol in the House of Representatives look positively amicable. Republicans need to get a grip, and fast, or they, and we, are going to lose the ability to halt this country's march to the left for perhaps a decade or more. The lessons of history couldn't be clearer. Divided parties lose elections. Parties that indulge their most unrepresentative dogmatists alienate the rest. Parties that put ideological purity over governing become neither ideologically pure nor any longer in government. In another example of our modern political inversion, some on the right defending their performance last week sounded uncannily like some Democrats who ripped each other limb from limb at their 1968 presidential nominating convention. Open debate is democracy at work, they say. Principle is passion. All true, for sure. But as we watched the spectacle unfold on C-SPAN's briefly liberated cameras last week, I couldn't help but be reminded of the observation of the French general who watched the British immolate themselves in the charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava in 1854. It's magnificent, he said, but it isn't war. I'm Jerry Baker of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You can read my free expression column every Tuesday in the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. You can also watch my TV show, Wall Street Journal at Large with Jerry Baker, every weekend on the Fox Business Network.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. Did you hear the news? Now you can. With instant updates from Fox News for Amazon Alexa. Just say,
Alexa, play news from Fox.
In Fox News.
It's the latest when you need it, on demand, from Fox News and Amazon Alexa.